Okay, so the idea of bulletproofing, you may or may not have noticed some of the issues that we have with our web forms the way they are right now, but they aren't 100% safe to use. I'll show you in a second what I mean. With typical, any application that's been done on a computer for years, very quickly, developers learned that they have to protect the software and the database in particular from end users. If there's anything that they can do wrong, they will do wrong, right? For example, opening up a record to edit and just start typing and replace everything there, right? Because they want to add a new record and things like that. Like, if you can think of it, they will mess it up, right? So we have to bulletproof things to try and protect the data from getting corrupted in some way or another, okay? Windows form applications, what we used to often do in code is we would kind of loop through all the elements of the page and lock things down depending on what mode we were in. What developers quickly figured out is that there are basically two different states, right, for the user interface. Either things are open for data to be changed, that could be because you're inserting or you're editing, right? The only real difference between those is if it's a new record, but basically the state of the interface is the same. Or you're not in that mode where the data is accessible, so you're not inserting or editing. And in that case, all your navigation controls should be available and the editing controls should be locked down. And that protects the user from accidentally changing something that they shouldn't, right? So you really just have two states to worry about for the most part, okay? And navigation controls should be available when you're locked down. When you're in insert or edit mode, the navigation controls should be locked down, because you don't want to be able to navigate to a different record when you're in the middle of editing something. And just to show you that problem, I actually have our page open here. So this is the actual patient page, just they're in the same project. So this is set up exactly the way we've done it in the past, right? So I just have my grid view and details view, swapping the visible property, and so on and so forth. And it's set up just as we've done. Let me show you part of the problem. Okay. So right now, yeah, I can't edit anything, which is good. That's fine. None of the rows are in edit mode. I'm not adding a new record. So my navigation control and my filtering and so on should all be available, and it is, right? I really only have one thing here, my filter. I don't have any other navigation controls. It's true that the pager would show up if I had more than 10 records, but the pager control was pretty smart. If you try to change the pager in the middle of editing a record, it just cancels the edit, right? So it's not really a big problem. But here, let me show you the problem. If I go back to all doctors, let's say the second row here, Wilma Flintstone, I'm in edit mode, right? If I change this to Gregory House, see that? The second row is still in edit mode, right? No command was issued to the grid to tell it not to be in edit mode. We just changed the data being presented. So suddenly, instead of editing Wilma Flintstone, we're editing Jane, right? That's obviously a big problem because, as I said, users will find any way they can to mess things up, right? So that would be a big issue. If I click add new, oh god, darn, I forgot to comment out that's a bit of code that I put in to bulletproof the add mode. We'll talk about that in a second. But if I cancel, right, then I can go back and redo my filter. If I'm in add new mode, right, and let's say I change the filter, the details view completely disappears, right? So that's another issue, okay? So there's lots of holes in our design, lots of things the user can mess up because we've given the ability to mess them up, right? So that's what our PowerPoint, our little discussion here is all about, okay? All right, so web forms being a little different, okay? Remember, we basically rebuild the page from scratch every time we post back, right? So we just have to decide, okay, what should be available to the user and what shouldn't, depending on that two-state approach. Should we have the data accessible, or should we have the navigation controls, filters, and so on accessible, right? So you can do this in more than one way, but this is kind of a tried and true approach that seems to pretty well always work. In page load, because the events happen in a certain order, page load happens before any of the other event handlers that we've put into the code, right? So we kind of reset things back to the standard way in page load, right? If we're going to modify what's available and what isn't, good spot to do that is in page load. And then the events that we've asked for by clicking a button or selecting an option or whatever, right? Those events will actually be processed later after page load. So we can decide, okay, if somebody asks for edit, right? Well, then at that stage, before the user is presented with the page, we can decide, well, in that case, we should disable any navigation or filters, right? And away we go. Lock those down so they can't try and change the filter or navigate to a different record because we're in the middle of editing or adding or whatever the case is, right? So it's an easy approach. Basically reset it in page load, and then in the event handlers that might put us into a mode that we do need to protect the data, disable. Disable, disable, disable anything that would navigate or filter and change the data presented in the controls, right? We often only have one navigation filter and control, then we can just change its properties, but this approach is pretty universal. Another thing we should do is make sure that any add or edit operation is complete before allowing another one, right? In other words, if right now, I've had my code in there, okay? But if I'm editing one record, right, before I go and edit another one, I should make sure that that was either canceled or something, right? There's just another approach that we can do. Okay, all right, so let's see just the simple one. The obvious one is this drop-down list, right? It should be disabled except when we want to be able to actually change the filter. If we're in the middle of editing or adding, we should disable it, right? So actually, so I could show the problems, I commented some things out in code. So if we go to the code behind here, right, we're using page and int just for my dynamic validation. We have our patient class giving us our metadata, right? Okay, so in page load for bulletproofing, besides clearing my label to show messages, what I did here, we're going to say, okay, our drop-down filter enabled is true, right? That way, we're going to start by assuming that we should be able to change the filter, because this gets processed first when we're actually preparing the page to display. But, for example, down here, if we click edit, okay, inside any row, right, then what we want to do is disable, right? So we set the enabled attribute or property of our drop-down filter to false. And that way, as soon as we click edit, the page gets rebuilt, presented to us. We will no longer be able to access or change our filter, our drop-down list of doctors at the top, right? I have another one up here. Now this is related to the add new, right? So we're doing a couple things in here actually, but first thing is, so if we've clicked the add new button, so we're going to swap over, show the details view and insert mode and so on. At the same time, we want to once more disable our filter, right? We saw what happened when we changed the filter when we were in insert mode, right? In the add new mode of a details view, the entire details view just disappears, okay? So that will prevent that from happening by disabling our navigation control, our filter. All right. Now the other thing I'm doing in here, just for a bit of extra bulletproofing, is we can check if you're clicking add new and you're already in the middle of editing a row, right? Here's that other problem. So if I'm editing a row and I click add new, then basically what I want to do is say, wait a second, no. You should finish the one change you're making before you go and add a new record. So we can check if we're in edit mode quite easily. This if structure here, if the edit index, because that's the index 0, counted from 0 for the first row and so on, that is the index of the row in edit mode, right? It'll be -1, by the way, if no rows are in edit mode. right? So you could write this logical expression a few different ways, but basically, if it's greater than or equal to 0, then we know that some row is in edit mode. And that's a simple logical test. We're editing some row inside the grid, and no, we probably don't want to allow them to swap the visibility and switch over into insert mode. So we'll actually use our label error, our little label, to show any messages to the user to say you must either save or cancel your edit before you can add a new record, right? And the else is the only place that we would swap the visibility. So basically it'll just stay on that page showing the error message to the user. That's another little bit of bulletproofing we can add here to the add new event. And I think that's basically it. The rest of this is our standard database error for our unique constraint on the OHIP number, so that no two people can have the same OHIP. I do also have this checking if affected rows is 0, right? So if there was a change to the timestamp because another user edited the record, then we don't want to let them update. Okay, we'll cancel it. Record was changed by another user. Okay. All right. Same thing on a delete. If we can't delete, it's probably because the timestamp had been changed. So we'll talk about this row data bound in a little bit. But that's it for our bulletproofing. So now we've put our code back in. Let's just see the difference in operation. So now when I click edit, okay, see that? You can see how the drop-down list is grayed out, so I can no longer actually try to change the filter because I'm in edit mode. When I cancel, page load looks after re-enabling it. Okay, it gets re-enabled at every chance. If I click add new, once more it's disabled. So I can't have that problem where I change the filter in the middle of adding a record and have my details view disappear. When I cancel, I come back, and now it's available. The other thing was, if I'm editing a record, okay, and I click Add New, well, there's my test. It determined that the edit index was, in this case, 0, 1, 2. Okay, so the edit index would have been 2, right, which was greater than or equal to 0, so I know I'm editing something. So instead of actually carrying out the default code that we've put in here for our Add New click event, it's giving our message that you must save or cancel your edit before you can add a new patient. So that's much more bulletproof, right? Little details like that make all the difference when you roll out an application in the real world, right? If you don't do some bulletproofing to prevent users from messing up things, I guarantee they will find a way to do it. Any questions about that? So there's really not too much more about bulletproofing. I've just given you some guidelines. There's not a recipe to follow because every page is a little different. There are times when you might, instead of just having one control, you might have multiple controls, right, that all have to be disabled. Well, in that case, what I suggest you do, I think that's even in my PowerPoint slide here, what I suggest you do, you can make a reuse, make a separate method to either lock or unlock different controls where you pass in a Boolean value for your two states, right? Kind of in your insert/edit mode, or you're not in that mode, and you pass in a Boolean and then set the enabled properties, locked properties, whatever, of as many controls as you need to support those two states. Okay, so that's it for bulletproofing. I'm not going to go through there's some other tips and tricks like how to do subtotals. Okay, like if you have a grid view with financial information, you want to show a subtotal at the bottom of in the footer, things like that. There's some tips on how to do that and other things inside. Oh, maybe this one is worth talking about because this is a real quick one to demonstrate. Whenever a page posts back and refreshes, it jumps to the top of the page, right? It hasn't been a problem for us so far because pretty much all our controls have been near the top of the page. But that's not always the case, and it can be very disconcerting to the user if every time you post back you have to scroll back down to where you were working, right? There's a simple attribute of the page directive. That page directive is right at the very top, okay, where you can set maintain scroll position on post back to true or false. Well, if you don't specify, it's false, right? So you set it to true, and that way whenever it refreshes the page, it goes back to the scroll position where it was left. I can demonstrate that pretty quickly. What I did is while you were on break, I did a screenshot of my PowerPoint slide there on bulletproofing. Added an images folder here, and I put the screenshot in it, right? So to actually put that on the page, I can just drag and drop it out of Solution Explorer. Oh, notice it prompts me for alt text and so on. Very good practice for people with reading issues, disability stuff. Always have an alt text, but because I'm in a hurry, I'll just say okay. So there it is, a nice big image at the top of the page. So let's see how that causes a problem for us now, right? So here's my patients, here's my image. So I come down here, I click edit on Billy Smith. Okay, oh, I have it in code. Sorry, I forgot to remove it. What would have happened is it would have come back here and I would have had to scroll down, right? Kind of blew my demo because I put the code in there. All right, so you'll see that it comes back to where I'm working because I do have that set to true. Otherwise, this is what I'd be looking at every time I did anything, right? Darn. Talk about how to mess up a demo. Silly David. Okay, if I go into the source, go to the top, see maintain scroll back position. Here, I'll just set it to false for a second, which is the default. Just so you can get a sense of how frustrating it is. So come down here, click add new, and instead of seeing my nice insert mode details view, I have to scroll all the way down to see it again, and so on and so forth. So that's really irritating. You saw how it was solved by setting that to true. So at least it maintains that scroll back position, on when it's reposts the page. So if I click add new, there I am. Now it does flicker quite a bit, right, with that image there. So maybe just with the time, because we do have a little bit of time left, we'll just talk about that Ajax business that was on the other page. How could we Ajaxify this so we don't get this whole flicker effect every time the page reloads, right? All right, a couple quick steps to it. Sometimes I find it easier to set the insertion point. I want to be inside the form. That's the only trick for this this first control we have to add. In the toolbar, you see here our Ajax extensions. So this script manager has to be somewhere inside the form tag. So I'll just click inside the form tag, add the script manager. Bada bing, right? It shows visually on the page, okay? Up here as the script manager, because it's just right inside the form. I'm wondering if I should get rid of that. No, I'll leave the graphic there. What the heck, why not? Okay. All right, so that's the first step. Now we can add an update panel. Notice there's a few other things here. There's a timer, update panel. The timer is useful for animations and so on as well, because you can have an update progress in case, because it'll do everything asynchronously, right? So if you're waiting for data, if you want, you can use an update progress to give like a little animation going to, so they see that something is happening while you're waiting for the data to come back from the server. But anyway, we'll just throw on an update panel. So I'll maybe just do it. Do it outside this div. Why not? Okay, I'll put everything basically inside the div in the form inside an update panel. So I can just double click there. So it adds the update panel. Right, there's my /update panel. No real need to give it a name. Now it's empty right now. But as I said before, you at the very least have to have a content template. So this defines the region, okay, the actual content of your update panel. Separately, we can have our triggers, but we don't need a trigger if the triggering elements are all inside the update panel. I only needed that on the other page because I had the filter button outside of the update panel, right? But if it's inside, then I don't need to. So basically, I'm going to just copy everything from this div tag using the arrow, shift and arrow, way down to the bottom here. So I'll include the closing div tag inside the form. Control X. So I cut all that out, okay, and I'll paste it inside the content template of my update panel. That's it. It's all in there. We've got a lot of white space there, but not that it really matters. By the way, when you mess up the indentation of everything and so on, sometimes things get, when you copy and paste code and move it around, you can always go like this. You can go down to Edit and Advanced. Sometimes it's there, but Format Document. And that'll just refix all the indentation levels of all your tags and so on. Okay, kind of a nice trick to know. Okay. All right, so with that inside the Update panel, let's just see what happens. So now instead of this whole page being refreshed every time I click a button or something, it's all being done with AJAX calls in the background. So I'm not actually reloading the page, right, at any point here. So I can edit this, update the database, right, and everything just stays rock solid on the screen. It'd be very, very hard to measure the difference in speed, because of course the server is sitting on the box in front of me, right? But you know, if you actually had to travel quite a bit through the internet, if this was hosted somewhere around the world, then yeah, you'd actually have a perceptible difference, okay, in the performance of the web application. So that's one reason why AJAX is very popular. It gives you a much more kind of steady, less flickery interface, plus it actually does improve efficiency in the vast majority of situations, right? But we still notice we still have all of our our bulletproofing is in place here because everything is inside the content panel, right? So my drop-down list works and so on and so forth. Okay, it gets disabled when I need it to and things like that. All right, so maybe I'll post a slightly revised version of the example, okay, up in Blackboard, because I've made a few changes, adding this update panel and so on. And I'll maybe take out the graphic because that's not really needed there. All right, any questions about that? Okay, well that's basically it for the content that you're going to be responsible for. So I'll